let's turn now to what's happening in the consumer brand space, the food space specifically today. We had a couple companies coming out, Pepsi, Conagra, Mars among them, basically saying that they're racial stereotype foods, many of which we all know, brands that we all grew up with. In this environment, it's time to finally say Aunt Jemima should no longer be the representation that we're seeing on our shelves. Uncle Ben also on there as well. Heidi Chung joins us now for the latest on the food space. And Heidi, again, I think we saw this news today and you said, yeah, it's actually ridiculous that these brands are still out there in 2020. What changed just today? And I guess it's sort of like finally, but where did this, I guess, movement, and we've seen, again, multiple companies come out and say something today. Where did this kind of come from?
Well, Miles, I think the power of the protests that we've seen across the country and across the world really over the past few weeks has really started to turn words into action when it comes to a lot of these companies. And we can't downplay the fact that this is a huge move. It's great news. All of that is nice, but it took over 130 years for Quaker Oats, which is now owned by PepsiCo since 2001, to finally say, hey, we're going to scrap this and we're going to admit that this brand was built on a racial stereotype. The Quaker Oats spokesperson saying in a statement that, quote, we recognize Aunt Jemima's origins are based on a racial stereotype. While work has been done over the years to update the brand in a manner intended to be appropriate and respectful, we realize those changes are not enough. Now, the Aunt Jemima that we see on packaging right now has evolved over the years, but the origin of the brand is from a song titled Old Aunt Jemima, and that was from a minstrel show performer, and it was also a song that reportedly was sung by slaves back in the day. It took over 130 years. You also mentioned Uncle Ben's rice. Now, that is all owned by Mars Inc. That company, just hours after we heard the announcement from Quaker Oats, came out and said, hey, we're also considering scrapping the branding that we have for Uncle Ben's rice. We have no idea what it's going to look like, but we're also going to join the movement. So, Miles, I think a lot of this just comes down to the fact that it's been so long since a lot of these companies have actually started to take a look at their portfolios, take a look at their brands, and recognize that it's actually not okay to have this kind of racial stereotyping on these packaged goods. And I do also want to call out the fact that while Black Lives Matter has certainly been a very influential movement, we also have to recognize that companies like Chiquita, right? You see those stickers on the bananas, that is also racially stereotyping Latinos and Latinas. So I think that there's still a lot of work to be done here, but certainly a step in the right direction.
And guys, as Heidi mentioned, it took so long. And on balance, of course, it's great that these changes are happening, but it also is in many ways kind of blatantly disingenuous. I mean, why now? Well, because now they're all being reshamed. And now here we are. Now, finally, this appears to be the tipping point. We have reached the moment. And this is it, baby. And we're going to see all of the questionable mascots, logos, brand names maybe have a reckoning. We have arrived at the reckoning. And again, great. But at the same time, it's just kind of remarkable it took this long. And for some of these companies to come out and announce these things now, there's a little bit of that undertone of, well, now we've realized. I mean, it was always a problem. It's been a problem for decades or for even longer. There are just so many examples happening right now. I mean, the Oklahoma State football coach who wore a certain T-shirt, and then he did an apology video this week saying, once I learned what the news network that I wore a T-shirt of believes, oh, come on, you didn't know before? And then similarly, Lady Antebellum, a country group that I'm actually a big fan of, they have announced this week, we're dropping Antebellum from our band name and we're going to go by Lady A because of what Antebellum represents. Well, It always represented that. And you knew that when you named the band that. But now, because the reckoning is happening, everyone is being forced into it. And one more note on this. I mean, you guys all remember a story that I covered very closely. I see this as part of the larger story that has been going on for 4 years of brands being forced into politics, being sort of shamed on social media, and a new reckoning coming where no longer are people standing for a middle of the road, sit on the fence PR statement. I mean, remember tiki torches had to respond when tiki torches were used in the Charlottesville March. Remember when the NFL first had the kneeling protest and all the NFL sponsors were asked, where do you stand on the protest? And they had to come out and comment. Now, of course, it's even more so. This is the real reckoning compared to 4 years ago, but it's all been happening for a few years now. And I just wonder, the next question is, will it hit sports? Will the Redskins be forced to finally do something? Will the Cleveland Indians be forced to finally make a change?
Well, I mean, the only thing though, Dan, is like I think the main difference between this and the examples you just outlined is, these are massive consumer brands that have tons of research on what their consumers do and don't want. And it's obvious from the work they've done in the last couple of weeks that Aunt Jemima is now offensive to the majority of their potential consumers. And, Heidi, that's what this is about, right? There's obviously a climate in this country where people are now saying, this is wrong and I'm offended by this, as opposed to, I think, maybe the more cynical view of, oh, well, Aunt Jemima's or, Pepsi is backed into, changing this name. I think Pepsi said, actually, it's bad. And the research says it's bad. So we're going to make that change. It's not like people were sitting there necessarily and forcing this kind of change upon Pepsi. I think enough consumers said this is wrong and we want this to end.
And Miles, just to that point, also we have to think about the time that we're in right now, right? Social media is such an impactful, influential force right now. And we've seen a lot of social media posts go viral calling out Aunt Jemima. And I don't know if you guys saw this last week, but The Onion had published something calling out Aunt Jemima, saying that they had rebranded it, calling it Sheila, who was this strong, powerful Black lady who went to Dartmouth and only eats pancakes sometimes. And so that was kind of a riff on that entire issue of the fact that Aunt Jemima is built on a racial stereotype. And I laughed at it at the time, but it made a lot of sense. And I think the timing of this announcement too is just very, it just speaks a lot to what is going on right now, but also the fact that the company is just essentially just being called out by all of these people that are refusing to purchase the goods at this point. So like you mentioned, people are just now saying, we're not going to buy it.
Yeah, and I think, again, it speaks to why, in my opinion, and I think the opinion of many, I'm not breaking news here, this time is very different in terms of how consumers and how I think the general population views, the justice movement that's happening right now in this country versus, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, various things came up and it was seen as reactionary. I think this is very much, no, things are going to change. And while, again, the changing the name of Aunt Jemima pancake syrup isn't going to, kind of undo centuries of injustices. I think it's an acknowledgement that people say, okay, enough is enough, and we're going to go forward under a different framework here over the next several decades and hopefully longer than that. All right, Heidi Chung, thanks so much for joining. We will talk to you soon.